I'm Ben Wattenberg in Geneva, Switzerland. Business leaders from around the world are gathered here to discuss what is now routinely called the global economic crisis. The topic before the House is capitalism in a ditch. This week on Think Tank. In the last 2 decades, the free market economies of the world have been thriving. But in the last year, bad news has been overwhelming good news. The world's second largest economy, Japan, has seen a poor situation worsen. Unemployment is now surging. The Japanese stock exchange, the Nikkei, is at its lowest point in years. Japanese banks have doled out $1 trillion in bad loans. Elsewhere in Asia, banking and currency crises have roiled markets in Hong Kong, Thailand, South Korea, and Malaysia. Foreign investment, which once flowed into these countries, has fled amid charges of crony capitalism, corruption, criminality, speculation, and government interference. Russia's economic picture is near catastrophic. The value of the ruble has collapsed despite billions of dollars of loans from the International Monetary Fund, the IMF, yielding massive poverty and political chaos in a nation still armed with nuclear weapons. Is Latin America next? Mexico received a controversial bailout just a few years ago. The current situation in Brazil is critical, dicey, and potentially contagious. On a happier note, Europe's huge economy is doing relatively well, having emerged from a long recession and moving now toward monetary union. Still, unemployment remains high, double digits in some countries. And in America, so far, the economy remains vigorous, growing, non-inflationary with very low unemployment. The almost $9 trillion U.S. economy is the anchor of global well-being for now. While the stock market has dropped, it has not suffered the stark declines that have plagued exchanges in Asia, Russia, and Latin America. But in an interconnected global economy, is America immune from problems elsewhere? With that in mind, Think Tank came to Geneva, Switzerland, to a meeting of the International Chamber of Commerce.
The ICC is an international organization for business everywhere in the world. It is made up of members from 130 countries, so that's a rather broad spread. And the members are large companies, medium-sized companies, small companies. The members are also business associations, chambers of commerce as well, all kinds of business associations, and legal firms. There are quite a lot of legal firms that join because of our arbitration. The International Court of Arbitration is part of the ICC.
Business people from around the world gathered to discuss the future of the global economy. We invited 2 distinguished panelists from the conference to sit down with us to discuss an uncertain future. Stephen Hanke is a professor of political economy at Johns Hopkins University and a former economic advisor to the Indonesian government. And Victor Chu, the chairman of the First Eastern Investment Corporation in Hong Kong. Steve Hanke, Victor Chu, welcome to Think Tank. I've had a very interesting time here in Geneva at the International Chamber of Commerce. The mood in the business community a few years ago was that everything was rosy, the so-called new paradigm, free markets, capitalism was conquering all that it saw. And the flavor I had, I got yesterday at the sessions was sort of that everything was going crazy. Could you try to, perhaps starting with you, Steve, and then you, Victor, from your different perspectives, what on earth is going on?
Well, I think the media has the thing completely wrong. You have Russia, for example. The official lie from the IMF and the G7 and everybody else is that they've been going through a transformation from communism to some kind of market-oriented economy. This is just simply not true. They don't have communism. They don't have a free market. They don't have a transformation that's been underway. They really have a mutation of the old communist system. So that's why the thing is blowing up.
But Victor Chu, Russia is such a tiny part of the global economy. I mean, that's not the thread that unraveled everything, is it? It was in your part of the world that started it.
Yes, I think the macro fundamental of Asia has not changed. What has changed really is psychology, Ben. I mean, we have to understand when the problem started in July of last year.
In Thailand.
In Thailand.
Yeah.
It started off as a private sector debt crisis. And when you have a private sector debt crisis, market psychology really is key. It's almost as important as reality. And when psychology is negative, with the benefit of technology and global markets being far more interdependent than before, things could drop like a lead balloon.
But you say it's psychology, yet there were all the office buildings going up and nobody was renting them. There were all the apartment buildings going up, nobody was moving into the condominiums. I mean, you don't have to be a genius to know that's not some economic Freudianism that you have to say there's something wrong with the psychology. Didn't they overinvest?
Well, you did have a classic kind of so-called Austrian boom-bust cycle where you had excessively easy credit, which financed all these office buildings that ended up going empty. And then once they start taking the credit back in and tightening up because the bankers get worried about never being paid off because no one's occupying the buildings, then the balloon burst. And what happened in Asia, the problem, of course, when you have a balloon bursting, it's a bad situation, and then the IMF came in with medicine that made a bad situation a complete disaster because they imposed fiscal austerity.
IMF is the International Monetary Fund.
Yeah, the International Monetary Fund.
Their job is to do good things, not bad things.
Good
right?
things. And the U.S. Treasury, Secretary Rubin and Deputy Secretary Summers were a complete disaster in Asia because they misdiagnosed the problem completely. They went along with the IMF. Let's put in fiscal austerity, so that crushes demand down even further. Let's float the exchange rates and have very high interest rates to keep the float kind of stable. That crushes demand even further, and so you end up, the bubble burst and you have excess capacity. And then the IMF and the U.S. Treasury come in with two policies that crush demand even further and give you even more excess capacity.
Am I supposed to sing "God Bless America" now or something? That you in short.
We're in Geneva, Ben.
We're in Geneva.
We can say whatever we want.
Well, no, that's fine.
They might not let us back in.
I understand. Now, do you agree with that diagnosis? I mean, Steve seems to be saying that it was the fault of the U.S. Treasury, this whole thing.
Well, I think part of the problem we have is when the contagion spread, it spread much faster and far more severe than people have expected and used to and been trained to control this contagion. And the problem is we never had an experience to the magnitude like this.
Of the magnitude of
the magnitude. Now, we come back to Thailand for a moment. If it was just Thailand with excessive confidence, excessive liquidity, huge real estate.
What does that mean, excessive liquidity? We're going to have to define some terms for our viewers and for me.
Right. Excessive liquidity meaning we have a lot of international money willing and able to support Thailand without really looking at the fundamentals very critically. Now, if it's just Thailand...
Are these bankers we're talking about?
Bankers and
What are capital markets are these government?
No, I mean, what by that I mean that Asian companies were exposed to the global capital markets, that they were able to access short-term money in foreign currency at ease. And they invest back into their own home territory in longer-term project, which is local currency generating. So you have a mismatch of funding when the market turn very rapidly.
Why would, I mean, bankers, let's take bankers for a minute. The phrase, I guess by now it's become an oxymoron, is prudent bankers. What on earth are they doing and the capital markets pumping all this money in when they see the office buildings empty? I mean, why do you blame the secondary cause, the U.S. Treasury, when it was the other people who pumped it all up?
No, it again comes back to the IMF and U.S. Treasury, because if you look at the bankers, and this is, everybody's focusing, you see, on the borrowers and not talking about the lenders, which you want to get into now. And the lenders are really part of the problem, because the way the thing has been set up, we have now Japan's banking system is exposed to emerging markets to the tune of about 125% of their capital. The European banks are exposed, about 85% of their total capital is exposed to emerging markets. The U.S. is in pretty good shape. We only have about 35% of our bank capital exposed to emerging markets.
Does that mean that 35% of American bank loans are in less developed country economies?
It means that if you take all the bank loans from the U.S. To emerging markets, that would equal 35% of the bank's total capital. Of course, they have many other loans outstanding in Canada and America.
But they can loan out more than the amount of their capital. Is that the idea?
Oh, yes.
Yeah, I
yes.
see. So,
it
might only be 10% of their loans.
I
see, okay.
Right. If these loans go bad, Ben, let's say all of them go bad in Japan, the banks are completely bankrupt. They're wiped out. There's no capital left, nothing. They're under, and almost the same thing in Europe, you see. Now, why did they get overexposed? You say, why has this happened? Well, you have the IMF with the so-called moral hazard or socialization of risk, or the perception that the banks are going to
get. You got to explain that, moral hazard and socialization of risk.
What the banks do when they're going into a place like Russia, which any prudent banker would be insane to be investing in Russia. And so why did they go in? They went in because they expected ultimately the IMF to pick up the tab if things went bad. Just like in the Mexican crisis of 1995, the American banks and investors, particularly the investors in short-term CETE bonds, treasury bill type bonds in Mexico, they invested and got a high rate of return, and they invested with kind of their eyes closed because they said, well, the Federal Reserve, the IMF, somebody, the U.S. Treasury is going to bail us out if things go.
I'd like to ask a question here, because I'm not so sure whether IMF is the real villain. It may be, but take Steve's example. If by history we know that Russia is not going to honor its obligations, why are people investing in Russia? Something has gone wrong, because people, investors and banks and international agencies somehow have been led to believe, rightly or wrongly, that there has been changes in Russia. There is a new infrastructure,
right,
a new regime which provides a meaningful infrastructure for the protection of investors and creditors, but it wasn't there. Now that rings true time and time again in other emerging markets.
But who's blowing the sunshine over the picture? It's always the IMF. You listen to Monsieur Camdessou, and everything is fine in Russia, or we've just gone to Indonesia. We just finally Suharto's gone, and they're going to follow the IMF plan, and everything's going to be great, and on and on. So this gets into your first comment where you said that it's a psychological thing, you see, what's going on in the markets. It is, because we've had the picture painted in such a rosy way by the official position. This isn't just the IMF. They've got the thing way out here, and reality's way down here, and now the markets get rattled a little bit, and all of a sudden everybody realizes, oh, reality's way down here. So the expectations and the psychology just collapse on you, you see. So we have to have, this gets back to your comments yesterday about transparency, you see. You have to have the psychology and the attitudes and expectations matched up with reality.
Means that you know what's going on.
You know what's going on. In most of these places, you don't have a clue what's going on. Even Russia, Mr. Shubayas is admitted that he conned the IMF into giving that $20 billion extra money, and the IMF didn't even know what was going on. It was like they were just blindfolded.
We have to win back the real market. We have been taken over really by the virtual market. And
what is a virtual market?
Really is what people are led to believe, prospects, the world of derivatives, trading on the future prospects based on certain assumptions, which including the rule of law and the risk profile of a particular market, which has proven to be entirely wrong. Now, I want to come back and in defense of IMF and the World Bank, in certain markets such as Thailand.
Victor, be careful here.
Now, we will say, why did the World Bank, IMF did not blow the whistle before? Now, because if the problem started as a private sector debt crisis, as I mentioned, if they look at the public sector side, there's nothing wrong with the economy. They had net trade surplus. They had huge foreign direct investments coming into the country, and GDP per capita has been growing. They come out of poverty, and seemingly there was a free market system. They're globalizing. They're playing the international rules. So on a macro basis, it was rosy. But what we did look at is that in some of these emerging markets, there was such a close relationship between government, business, and banks that produced what we now call cronyism.
Crony capitalism, right?
Crony capitalism. And that distort the function of a free market.
Let me ask a final set of questions. The domino effect. Because this is an American program, is the last domino to fall going to be the United States?
Well, I think that's an exaggeration to say it's going to fall, but it will tilt over, and it comes in through two channels, really. The first one is going to be the stock market. I think we will have a bear market in the U.S. equities, and the reason for that is that the huge excess capacity that we have in Asia, which is 30% of the world's production. I mean, it's a huge chunk of the world economy. You've got Asia at 30%, U.S. at about 30%, and Europe at about 30%. Those are the big three chunks that make up the world economy, really. And you have a total depression in Asia, which I don't think we'll get out of probably for 5 years or so. I mean, we're in it for a long time. And this means that the Asians aren't drawing in goods from the U.S., and it means that they're selling a lot of things cheap to the U.S. This means that
keeping inflation low.
Yeah, it helps. It keeps inflation low, but it keeps the profit margins of U.S. companies squeezed down.
You know, the United States demographically now is pushing on to 300 million people. We've got a $8.5 trillion gross national product. I mean, why can't the United States, is the word autarkic, is that self-sufficiency?
Yes.
Why isn't the United States an essentially, can't it be an essentially autarkic country? I'm not saying it should be or that it's best, but
well, it isn't, because even if you were doing no trade with anyone at the present, but you had Asia out there with all these goods and services they want to sell to you cheaply, that means that your internal market, your autarky starts breaking down, because you've got the threat of some outsider wanting to sell something cheap. Even though you have 100% of the market, your company in the United States, you're watching over your shoulder and saying, well, the Asian guy out there is going to undercut me if I increase my price.
If I'm an American consumer, I'm getting my goods cheaper.
Well, ultimately, of course you are, because what this does, this takes the pricing power, this excess capacity in the world, Ben, takes the pricing power away from a U.S. company, even if he's producing something now that there are no imports.
Are you a bear on the U.S. the way Steve is?
I am. I just want to pick up the last point.
Am I the only bull around here?
I think politically, man, it will be inconceivable that the Congress will swallow over 300 billion in trade deficit. I think even if there are cheap goods around, Asian countries cannot just export the problem to America. That's one. Secondly, on the basis of...
So what will they do? Put up protectionist walls?
So what I mean was, yes, that will be the the grassroots political pressure, and on the basis that the American company share prices are fully valued, on the basis that certain sectors, particularly the technology sectors, are overvalued, on the basis that because of the Asian flu, a lot of the growth assumptions are distorted and would have to be reviewed materially. I think, and plus the fact that leadership in Washington probably would not have much time to focus.
You think this is so because of the personal scandal surrounding President Clinton?
Yes, and also some black spots around the region.
What does that mean, black spots?
I mean, we're looking at conflicts in the Middle East. We are looking at a potential worsening situation in Russia that may bring about further, political tensions. Now, these will all strain the very scarce resources of the executive. I think so. All these combined, I think America is going through a compounding. Will be suffering from a compounding effect of all these that will act as a catalyst for the markets to drift downwards. I don't believe there will be a collapse in the American market. As you say, it's a huge economy. American economy is very flexible.
What about Europe? What about Europe?
Europe is less so, in my view. Europe is far more structured. The economies are far more structured. It takes much longer to re-engineer themselves. I think I'm very concerned, and also the euro is coming on stream.
Has the so-called capitalist revolution of the last 10 years been good for the world? First you, then you.
I think the answer must be yes, but we're getting into the second stage. We're talking about responsible globality. Globalization as a process has gone a long way. Obviously, different economies have different pace in that process, and some of the troubled economies again will have different pace of recovery. People like Thailand, which have gone through a lot of reform, has really swallowed a heavy dose of medicine, will come through the first. And people are just going in will probably take a long time to come through.
Healthy, doctor?
Yeah, the linkage has been if you increase economic freedom, and last year I did a big study for the Joint Economic Committee on this, you increase economic freedom by 10% and you get about a 7.5% to 13.5% increase in GDP per capita. Now, that has, of course, more money in people's pockets, but why is it good? If you have more prosperity, people, it's literally good for their health. They live longer. And so if you take the bottom rung of countries and you can increase their GDP per capita from 500 to 1,000, they live about 6% longer, about 3.5 years longer. So you've got it. We have had more liberalization. This has stimulated world growth. That's why this boom that we've been in. I mean, people, everybody looks at their monthly statement on their mutual fund in the United States and see this big boom. Well, it's all connected with free markets and opening up and more globalization that we've had in the market economy. And so this has not only been good for the yuppie as well as the retired person in the United States and the stock market, but it's obviously good for those countries that are growing, like Argentina, for example. But
now it seems to have hit a wall.
Yeah, but the idea that we can do away with the business cycle and boom busts and so forth is just nonsense. I mean, we can't do that.
That's what this is, a normal boom bust cycle.
Well, I would say it's a normal boom bust, but fairly dramatic, because usually this happens in one little economy here, and then we had a group of big economies in Asia that all burst the bubble at the same time. You see, Japan burst the bubble in 1991.
Do you all see, this is really the last question, do you all see a global depression coming?
I won't say depression as in the severity of that term, but I would certainly see a severe softening of
global recession.
Yeah, I agree with Victor.
Okay, thank you very much, Victor Chu and Steve Hanke, and thank you. I am still bullish on America. I'm Ben Wattenberg.
We at Think Tank depend on your views to make our show better. Please send your questions and comments to New River Media, 1150 17th Street Northwest, Washington, D.C. 20036, or email us at thinktank@pbs.org. To learn more about Think Tank, visit PBS online at www.pbs.org. And please let us know where you watch Think Tank. This has been a production of BJW Incorporated in association with New River Media, which are solely responsible for its content.